all month we've been talking about 4 authors who have made major contributions to the Unity movement. We started with our co-founders, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, who were both born during August, and then last week was dedicated to Emily Cady, who is best known for the Unity classic Lessons in Truth. Today we finish the series with Eric Butterworth, and without question, he was the most commercially successful of the 4 of them with his blockbuster New York Times best-selling book, Discover the Power Within You. There it is. Still in print today, published back in 1968. Now this was the book, I think, that really helped to put Unity on the map, because Oprah and Maya Angelou got a hold of it and they talked about it, which resulted in Unity ideas going mainstream. After this book was published in 1968, Unity started to undergo this tremendous growth spurt. Started in the 60s, continued to the 70s, and then into the 80s, and then it started to slow down a bit. I blame Eric Butterworth. Because he did too good of a job. He did too good of a job. Before that book came out, before Oprah got a hold of it, you had to go to a Unity Center to get our message. Now everyone is doing it. Oprah, Chopra, Dyer, even this guy named Osteen. They're doing our thing. They're doing our thing. And I guess that's the way it should be. I guess that's a good thing. It's not a very capitalistic way of looking at it, but you really can't patent those kinds of ideas. They need to be freely shared instead of hoarded by trying to corner the market. They're freely shared, and that's the way it should be. That's the way it should be. Now, Eric was born Wilfred Eric Butterworth. He's a Canadian, Winnipeg, Canada, 1916. Now, you could have called him Will. You could have called him Fred. But instead, he decided to be known as Eric. Now, have you noticed that makes 3 out of the 4 authors we've talked about this month who have refused to use the first name that was given to them by their parents. Isn't that interesting? Probably part of that rebellious streak that we find in them. One of the reasons why they became spiritual pioneers. They had a rebel streak in them. They were individualists. So Eric, not too long after he was born in Winnipeg, moved to Southern California, which is where he basically grew up and went to school. And he was raised in Unity. His mother was a Unity minister. He didn't become a U.S. citizen until he joined the Army in 1941. World War II was just starting. He was a lieutenant in the medical corps, and he also served as a chaplain, of course, and as a counselor. And I'm sure that he knew Charles Fillmore because he attended Unity classes at Unity Village from 1938 to 1941, and then he went back after the war in 1946, and this was all while Charles was still speaking and still active in the movement. Eric became a Unity minister in 1948, and from there he went on to serve at and to build and grow some of the largest Unity ministries in the country. Started in Pittsburgh, and then from there he went to Detroit, where the Detroit Unity Temple became the largest Unity center in the country. But he wasn't done yet. Went to New York City, started a congregation there that met at Carnegie Hall. Later, they had to move to Avery Fisher Hall in Lincoln Center because they outgrew Carnegie Hall. He filled it every Sunday. I think we have some pictures up here if we haven't shown them already. Yeah, that's the Detroit Unity Temple. This next one I want to say is Pittsburgh. Actually, looks like Chicago, but anyway, there it is. Yes, Frank Lloyd Wright. Yeah, this is the interior of the Detroit Temple, and then we have, let's see what's next. Yeah, there's Carnegie Hall. And then we have Lincoln Center, and I think we have an interior site. That's where Brenda went. Yeah, Brenda went to Eric's church at Lincoln Center when she lived in New York. Yep. There it is. That was a big place. One of the first, I guess you could call it a mega church. With one important difference, though. I never had the opportunity to meet Eric, but I've heard a lot of his talks on tape. And he was not a high-powered dynamo like some of those mega-church preacher types that you see on TV now. But his style was so clear, so interesting, and so engaging that he didn't need to be anything other than 100% himself, which means that he would show up in complete integrity all the time. And I think it was that kind of clarity and integrity that made him so popular. You don't have to be flashy in order to communicate an effective message. I can think of a very popular New Thought speaker who Karen and I saw a few years back. I won't name this person, but this person was very dynamic and very flashy and entertaining and had everybody fired up for about 45 minutes. And when it was all over, I couldn't remember a thing that they talked about. Tons of anecdotes, lots of personal stories. It was all about that person, but no interesting and memorable ideas that were practical and that you took home with you and remembered and used. Not so with Eric. People remembered and they wanted to hear more. That's what Eric did for that generation after the Fillmores, and that's a very important period in any organization. There's always a crisis period which follows the death of the original founders of any kind of an organization, whether it's a church, a club, a corporation. And some organizations don't survive. They can't get over that. They can't get through that vacuum created by the loss of their founders. But Unity not only survived, it thrived thanks in large part to Eric Butterworth, who made the teachings accessible, put them into a new form of language, brought them up to date. Eric died on April 17, 2003, and I remember Karen and I were at Unity Village studying at Unity Institute, and I recall the morning when they announced his passing. It was a rather somber occasion, and some of the teachers and classmates were voicing concern about whether we had any new voices coming out of this generation to speak to the next generation. That's a legitimate concern, a legitimate question, and of course we do. We've had many new authors who are coming along and continuing to update the message. Unity is growing and evolving in ways that are robust and healthy, and that's what it's all about. A big message that we get from the universe, in case it hasn't tapped you on the shoulder yet and let you know about this, is all about change, right? The message we get from the universe is evolve or die. That's the message. We don't want to be the proverbial dinosaur in search of a tar pit, personally or as part of a larger movement. The beauty of evolution is that it builds on what comes before it. Or if I were to use the language of integral philosophy, it transcends and includes what came before it. That's how evolution works. That's how Unity has been working. One of my favorite Eric Butterworth quotes is all about evolution. He said this. He said, there's some of his other books. I meant to mention that earlier. He wrote several other books in addition to Discover the Power Within You. I particularly like In the Flow of Life. Spiritual Economics is excellent as well. But on to my favorite Butterworth quote, well, one of many. He said, a religion to be a contemporary influence must be redefined for every generation in the light of that day's thought. That's a message for us to heed, that we have to keep looking at what we're doing. We have to hold it up to the light of today's thought and decide whether it still makes sense, decide whether it still works. And of course, there are always some folks who don't want anything to be changed or redefined. They're allergic to progress. Discover the Power Within You was a book that was devoted to that kind of evolutionary change. He was redefining the way that we would look at the teachings of Jesus and Christianity in general. And there's a key question that he asks in that book, and it's this. He says, what did Jesus really teach? And Eric concluded in that book that the philosophy of Jesus is a workable philosophy, a way of life. Jesus taught the depth potential of man and of his spiritual unity with God. Strangely, religious groups have been the slowest of all to catch this vision. Not so strange, really. All too common. He was spot on about that last part. Religions are the slowest of all to get that message. Spiritual unity with God was the last thing that I was taught in parochial school when I was growing up. Spiritual unity with God was not something that we got. I was taught that the only way that you got to be with God was to die. That had to happen first, preferably in a state of grace. And you had to get the state of grace by going to a priest and receiving the sacraments. And even then, if you did that all right, you still had to go to this place called purgatory, where the stain of sin would be burned out of you to make you good enough to be with God. But remember, you're dead first. So that's the process. Well, in the prologue of Discover the Power Within You, Eric starts by telling this ancient Hindu legend. There was this story that says that there was a time when all human beings had God-like powers, but they started abusing their divine power. They got out of line. For you Star Trek fans, think of the character Q, this all-powerful alien entity who was always abusing his power to tease and harass Captain Picard and the crew of the Enterprise, and in one episode he was stripped of his power. So the chief god Brahma decides that the only thing to do to stop this abuse is to take away their divinity, to take away their power, and hide it where they would never be able to find it. But Brahma couldn't figure out where to put it, so he calls this council of all the lesser gods to help him decide what to do. And first they said, well, let's bury it deep in the earth, or let's put it at the bottom of the ocean, or maybe at the top of the highest mountain. And Brahma said no, because there is no place on earth or in the sea that human beings eventually will not reach. So here's what we'll do. We'll hide this power deep down inside each person, because they will never think to look for it in there. And ever since then, the legend goes, human beings have been going up and down the earth, climbing and digging and diving and exploring and searching for something that they already have inside themselves. The greatest spiritual teachers in human history were great because they discovered this best-kept secret of the ages, which is, as Eric puts it, the divinity and the power within us. And there's a word for that, which I will dare to utter this morning. It's called humanism. And look at what happened to a lot of those spiritual teachers who wanted to let us in on this great secret, this truth. Some of them, we know, were killed for their trouble. Other times we ignored the message and we turned the messengers into gods. We built monuments to them, and then we went ahead and worshipped them as if they were the power and the divinity. And once again we succeed in putting it outside ourselves. Buddhists did it, Christians did it, Hindus did it too. Now don't get me wrong, I have no problem with doing things to show that we love and honor and respect a great teacher, or show our gratitude for what they gave to us, but the problem is when we forget about the teachings. Eric wants to make sure that we don't do that. The one thing that the great spiritual teachers all have in common is this. They all tell us that the only way we're going to be able to find that divinity, or as I'd rather say it, our power, is by bringing about radical, positive, and permanent change in consciousness. And yet, how often do we find ourselves trying to control our external conditions? We try to change and control what goes on around us, thinking that that's what's going to bring us the security, the peace of mind that we so desperately are seeking. Chapter 3 of Discover the Power Within is devoted to that question. It's called The Great Decision. the great decision that we have to make is choosing where we look for this thing we call happiness, this thing we call peace of mind. And it's a tough decision because we're not very well supported by our larger culture. We have this domineering, overwhelming message that we get from our culture, which goes something like this. You will never be happy unless you have, and you can fill in the blank, certain kind of car, so much money, house with a bathroom in every bedroom or whatever, a wrinkle-free face and body and all that stuff we do to ourselves. Another one of the books I pointed out earlier, In the Flow of Life, Eric writes this. He says, great is the delusion that I will be happy when, fill in the blank. There is no true happiness in accomplishment other than the fleeting moment of exhilaration. Tomorrow, we have to find the vision to meet a new day. Happiness comes when one knows that they are in the flow of life and of the guidance to live it fully and well. That's some wisdom. In addition to being a great writer, Eric was also a musician, as we heard earlier, that poem at the beginning of the service. In fact, he wanted to be a singer. That was what he was thinking about doing at one time, was becoming a singer. He was a musician, and he was also an artist. When he was writing that book, In the Flow, there was this image that came to him, and he turned it into the logo that he used at his centers, and he uses it in his books. So here it is. Now, this is kind of interesting because look around the platform. You notice anything that looks similar? Yeah. Now, I don't know if Kathleen had this in mind when she did that. I don't believe I talked about Eric before she did this. She had the same vision somehow. But this showed up on the platform, and of course I already knew about this. But it's very interesting because the way this works is there's a little, you see this little thing in the center here? That's a person. That's supposed to be you. And then those arrows that are coming in represent the flow of the universe, as he likes to put it. He calls it the universal flow of life, love, substance, and inspiration that comes flowing into us. But also, he has these arrows that point back out again. So we radiate it back out into the universe. So that's what I choose to interpret our sign over here. I choose to interpret that the same way. And it's partly from an idea that he got from Greek philosophy. There's a fellow by the name of Plotinus who said, the whole universe comes rushing, streaming, and pouring into me from all sides while I stand quiet. And Eric was known to say that at different times during the different talks that he gave. So he was influenced by Plotinus, and that's how he came up with that wonderful logo. Well, the paradox here is that it takes a lot of practice and some effort to wake up from the illusion or the delusion that we've learned to buy into. It takes work to stand quiet, if you can believe that. It takes work to stand quiet because the mind does not want to stop chattering. It'll challenge us every step of the way because we're so afraid that we're going to lose something. The truth is that we gain so much more when we learn this different way of being in the world. Eric calls it living from the inside out. Life is lived from the inside out. That's another consistent message that we get over and over from him. The chattering mind will challenge us every step of the way because it doesn't like what it sees, and it thinks we're going to lose something when in fact we're going to gain everything. It just doesn't look the way we were taught or conditioned to expect. Within every challenge, there's an opportunity. Within every obstacle, we can find the way to move forward and to move beyond the obstacle. That's the message we get from Eric. It's a message we hear in Buddhism and Stoic philosophy. Eric found a way to tap into something that's timeless and make it accessible to more and more people. And it can't stop there, because we are the next generation. We're the ones who have to keep on walking the talk, make sure that we keep refining and redefining those ideas so that we will reach that next generation and continue to be relevant. So we've got some important work to continue that Eric has helped get us started on. And next week we are going to be shifting our focus to some of the work of Martin Luther King. He gave a very impressive lecture to the Nobel Committee when he received the Nobel Peace Prize, and there are so many wonderful pieces of wisdom in there. So we're going to spend 3 Sundays in September talking about that. We'll have the World Day of Prayer as well. Our chaplains will be doing that service, so come on back next month.